I absolutely love speaking with Alex Ebert. The last conversations we've had have been tremendous. I use freak theory all the time, and he had a tremendous conversation with Tim Adalin at Voicecraft on the Overton Window that I just thought the thinking on it was just invaluable for thinking our moment and to think politics and how to approach it and what's very often going on in political movements and the approach to the Overton Window that he brought in and thought it alongside freak theory is incredibly important. And like I said, I think about freak theory all the time. The emphasis on the encountering of limits is absolutely necessary for thinking today. In that precise moment, that surprising moment when a limit is encountered, if that is missing from one's thinking, whether it be philosophy, economics, or whatever, there's a problem. That has to be taken very seriously. And I think it's basically, I think you've made a very powerful case in your work, Mr. Ebert, that that's basically axiomatic, that that's a working assumption. That is a very good working assumption. If there is no encounter of limit in your thinking, then you better have really freaking good evidence that that's acceptable, because the case that has been made that the encounter of limits is essential is very powerful, and I think it's a very powerful working assumption that I use myself all the time. So I appreciate it. So I appreciate your thinking on that matter. So Alex Ebert, if I were to ask you, what is the Overton window? What is your thinking about it, and the relation, also the critical turn of phrase that you used that was very helpful with Tim on the difference between changing things and things changing. And then the idea of voting as setting goalposts, I think, was also very powerful. So if I were to throw it at you on those topics, I will do that. And again, thank you for being here. It's always a treat.
Thank you for letting me be here in my pajamas. I just want anyone watching to recognize that I'm in my pajamas and that I just woke up. Um, such a the Overton window. I'm actually really excited about speaking from a place of like sort of nether. The Overton window is, I think, the easiest way to think about it is the moving of the goalposts. It's the moving of the political parameters of acceptable dialogue with regard to implementable policy. So that's what we say when we're like, oh, we're moving the goalposts, or like suddenly Trump gets elected and all of a sudden a really liberal person used to be the person that we thought was a total centrist, right? So the field moved. And now the people who were previously considered liberal over here, but like just, not extreme, just liberal, are now outside of the field, and now they are the extremists, right? And suddenly the centrist is now is on the extreme left side of the inside of those parameters. And suddenly the centrist liberal position is the most liberal thing we can get done. And the same thing happens on the right. When we move things really far to the left, obviously, those poor conservatives can't have slavery anymore because we moved the goalposts. And talking about that is now outside of the Overton window. So that is the basic idea, is that as history progresses and we make sort of political change, those political policy changes have societal, cultural implementation that result in parameters of acceptability. And it's really that implicit acceptability that sort of speaks to the effect of law. That law, for instance, banning slavery, outlawing slavery, ends up having an aggregate cultural implicit effect in which we develop a morality which is not otherwise essential to the culture of America, right? That had to be cultured. That, I mean, the whole name of culture is, I mean, we couldn't have chosen a better name for culture, right? Culture must be cultured. And in order to culture it, you must take pains to exert effort on it from the sort of outside. You must actually molest the culture to change the culture, to create the culture. Whatever the culture is, it has been molested. It has been fucked with by, and usually by laws. And laws tend to implement explicit laws, implement implicit behavioral codes. And those implicit behavioral codes then define the Overton window, right? Now, it goes the other way. This is what sort of like the Mackinac Institute was trying to figure out. Is like, how do we make it go the other way? Sure, laws create culture, but how does culture create laws? Well, culture creates laws when think tanks like us, they thought, intentionally cultivate culture without law. And then the lawmakers have to come to us, right? And so now the politicians are viewed more properly in a true democracy where the people actually have the power. Like if we were to think, okay, a place where the people have the power, right? A real democracy, what does that look like? Well, then it wouldn't look like a place where the law is always changing the people. Instead, it would actually look like a place where the people are always changing the law. Now, how does that work? Now, if you're an activist, you're really interested in this because you think, well, power to the people. I'm out there on the street. I want to change law. Well, the way that works is that we, because the Overton window works on implicit bias instead of explicit law, then we change the implicit bias by changing culture. And then the politicians have to come to us. So we change the parameters of the field. Because the parameters of the field are already in the implicit zone, whether or not they are progenited from law, whether or not they come from or originate from law, they reside in the implicit zone. That's where the Overton window sits, and those are where the parameters lie in our moral structure and our sort of ethical parameters, which all are implicit. We don't think, oh, I don't like slavery because it's illegal. We would never say that, right? That would make us feel like we're some kind of sheepish automatons and that we don't have any interior. Instead, we like to own it and say, no, I believe that it's wrong because my soul, my essence, I have essentially figured that out. I've been born that way even. I am essentially moral. So if we're going to recognize that those parameters are implicit, then we also have to recognize that we can actually skip law. We can fuck with whatever is already implicit by having conversations, by being activists, change and put pressure on one another to change our opinions. And because there is no force greater than status anxiety. There is no force, be it law. The great invisible hand is status anxiety, not law. So if we can pressure one another to feel anxiety if we're not behaving in accord with the group to which we belong, then we can affect the implicit bias that determines the Overton window. And then the politicians have to adjust, and what the politicians essentially have to then be viewed as are proxies, fundamentally hypocritical, fundamentally empty and vacated proxies, which adjust to the Overton window, which has been moved and adjusted by the people. And that is a real democracy. And it's the only kind of real democracy, because when we decide, well, we're going to forgo that, and instead what we're doing is depending on a true politician, and by true I mean I'm speaking from the place of ignorance in which I feel completely disempowered, and I'm depending on a queen or a king figure to come in on their white steed with their essentialized view and embody all of my hopes and dreams and change things for me. Well, that's not the power of the people. That is something else. That's some bastardized version of a democracy. That's basically monarchy light, right? So the real democracy is where we change the Overton window and the politicians come to us. And this is what the Mackinac Institute figured out, right? They're like, okay, well, we want to affect policy. We want to have a sense of power. And they're in their little dark and shrouded secrecy. And they're like, we're like a little libertarian think tank, and we're going to change culture. Well, how do we do that? We have to feel empowered. How do we feel empowered? We have to recognize that actually where the implicit power of culture lies, where the parameters of politics lie are actually in the implicit nature of culture. And they always reside there, and they always move from there. So this all got me thinking that, well, okay, you have think tanks that are thinking properly about democracy, right? But then we say, then we lament them, and we say that they're awful, sort of shadowy figures puppeteering democracy, and that they're anti-democratic. No, they're the only ones operating from a place of real democracy where the people have the power. They're the only ones thinking in the proper way about power of the people, and the politicians are the puppets. If you think the politicians are not the puppets, then you're the puppet. If you think the politicians are the puppets, then you may be the puppeteer. And that's what you're supposed to think in a democracy, right? Now that means that you can't, or you shouldn't, or you'd be naive or ignorant to think that politician has changed their mind. I can't trust them. The whole idea of being a puppeteer is that you can manipulate figures to do things that were once oppositional to what they were doing, or that are now oppositional to what they once were doing. That's the power of a puppeteer. Politicians are proxies to execute the will of the people, meaning if the will of the people is here, the politicians do this. If the will of the people is here, politicians do this. The paradigm of electing politicians who are essentially from one position or another, and if they have ever changed their mind, they can no longer be trusted, is monarchy light. That's not power of the people. That's completely disempowered position from which to engage in politics. And of course, what it does is, instead of viewing the vote, the election, as the setting of the field for the game of play, it views election as the game of play, which it isn't. Now, last thing I'll say, which we spoke about before we started recording, probably the thing that vexes me most coming from the left, is everything I just said is sort of implicitly, but probably not consciously understood by most of progressive leftist activists. And the reason why I know that they at the very least implicitly understand everything I just said is that they do not want to succeed in any given election. The reason they do not want to succeed in any given election is that they know that the population is behaving in this monarchy-light, disempowered way. And that anytime their guy, their prince, their angel of destiny gets elected, they say, oh, I guess we won the game. Now I get to give up. Now I don't have to do anything. Right? Because the embodiment of my vision was elected, and that was the game, wasn't it? No. No, that was the setting of the field. Or you are not in a democracy, or you're in monarchy light. But if it's the setting of the field, which it's supposed to be, then you're in a democracy. Then you say, what I elected are the parameters of the game of play. And now I throw down. I've set the field to my advantage. And now I play, right? Now I move culture, and I move that politician to me. And I don't give a shit if that politician once said this and now says this, and I can't trust them for this. That is the disempowered, undemocratic way to view the entire process of democracy. So what I really kind of loathe, obviously, is that the politics of activism implicitly understand that the people mistake the election for the game. and therefore intentionally seek to sabotage any election for their own side. Because if we never win an election, our side will always be engaged in the game, which is not the game, which is the setting of the parameters of the game of play. And so the activist, thinking that this is the best approach, given the circumstances of a public which mistakes the election for the game, seeks to constantly suspend the election in a state of play, where our elected are our opposition. And what I'd love, and the reason why I'm completely convinced that activists don't understand that the election is the setting of the parameters for the game of play, and instead mistake the election for the game, is that there's almost no public education about the actual path to public empowerment from any of these activists. They all simply say, if we elect our side, which is not the absolute pristine embodiment of all of our exact positions, if we do not play the game of monarchy light, then if we elect someone from anywhere in our zone of our side, we'll give up. We'll stop protesting. All of the things we've worked for will cease to be important to our constituency. And so we must deprive them of that false win and continue to engage them in the game of sabotage. And this is why we experience progress as 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Because progressives don't understand how the game is played and do not educate themselves and their constituency about the actual path to empowerment in a democracy. Last thing I'll say that we've talked about, and I know that you want to discuss, is that the implicit sabotage, which I've just described, is further complicated and enticed by the problem of the struggle cluster and the enhanced features of identity that we all get when we belong to a struggle cluster. And the more asymmetric that struggle cluster, the narrower, the deeper. The narrower the struggle cluster, the more impossible its position toward symmetry, the more impossible its relationship to symmetry, the deeper and more profound the sense of belonging. And so we have, unfortunately, an easy shortcut to a more profound sense of belonging through sabotage. And there is a solution to this, but the solution, I almost feel like you have to paint the solution visually. If you always think of yourself as upon the vanguard, then you will always enjoy, no matter where the state of play is, if you're always on the vanguard and you're always position yourself pulling the field from the outside of those parameters, you'll always feel a sense of that asymmetry. You'll always feel a sense of enhanced belonging. You'll always feel a sense of the depth of symmetric impossibility, because you'll be saying something which is so far outside or so far left of field that you will still get that sense of enhanced belonging. You just simply always have to be on the vanguard. And that's why I continue to think that the most empowered position for the activist is to cease the naive fantasy that your positions are essential and begin to view them as instrumental so that you can move from one position to the other. That is the definition of being on a vanguard or being a vanguardist, is the ability to continue to progress, to continue to be at the front, which means you must leave what you are on currently behind at some point. You must be willing to allow your asymmetric position today to become a symmetric position tomorrow, and thereby boring to you tomorrow, and thereby leaving it. But in doing so, allowing your position today to succeed. And yes, every success is a death. And yes, it's painful, but grow up. If you do not truly care about the position you're holding today, then sure, hold on to it as an asymmetry and sabotage and hold on to that one asymmetric position and ensure that it can never succeed so that you'll always have that particular struggle to belong to. But if you do care about that position on any level, then you'll want to see it graduate into symmetry, which means you'll want to see your affiliation with that position as a vanguardist, as a magnet for your struggle cluster. You'll want to see it dissipate into the symmetry of general acceptability, at which point it will no longer be an attractor for your sense of belonging. And yes, you'll lose the sense of belonging associated with that particular struggle. However, if you're on to the next, then what's the problem?
Yeah.
So you have to allow the death to occur. You have to allow the encounter with limit, as you love to say, to occur with any given political crusade. You have to allow it to fulfill itself, thereby dying in terms of your experience with its specialness and its ability to bind in religious terms you with your fellow activists. You have to allow that sensation to die, and thereby the work of your activism to succeed. And that's the growing up. That is the idea of approaching politics from a place of non-neurotic acceptance of death, from a place of, it's like you said, I like that line that I like saying, we cannot care so much about changing things that we're unwilling for things to change.
Well, Mr. Ebert, the Netherlands that you've been visiting is full of fire, so I really like that place. Man, oh my goodness. So there's a few things. So first off, I couldn't agree more with what you just said. There's a difference between that belonging on the limit. It's almost like be limiting versus belonging, if I were to throw out a phrase, like finding the belonging in this limit that then makes you not residing in a certain stable state that requires always having an enemy, never actually accomplishing anything. So in a funny way, that always having a problem to solve actually almost becomes a stable state, because the stable state is always having a problem to solve that you never solve. So it's ironic in that sense. Whereas it's actually on the willingness to accomplish something that you're not stable, right? And that would fall into freak theory. So it's like, when we talk about, the problem is traditional belonging, belonging again, part one, are all these stable states that leads to all these pathologies, right? So belonging again has to be on the encounter and on the limit. So you could almost call it belimiting, or say, if I were to throw out a phrase, because that is growing up. I cannot agree more. That is so perfectly put. And it's the vanguard. It's almost like people want their cake and to eat it too. They want to be on the vanguard, but in a stable state. Well, that by definition doesn't work. You can't be on the cutting edge in a stable state. The only way to be on the cutting edge is on the limit. In a sense, you have to cut the stable state. You have to cut your activism. If you never cut it, you're not on the cutting edge, because you're not bleeding, because another way to put it, if there's no possibility of losing your belonging, then you're not in the belonging again. You're in traditional belonging, which is very problematic. If there's no risk of having to change or do something different or transform, then you're not belonging on the limit. Be limiting. You're not on the actual encounter. You're dealing with a self-sabotage or a self-deception or something like that. And I think you put it very well. I definitely think that one of the ways that people create meaning and belonging for themselves if they're not willing to be on the limit is self-sabotage. Because in a way, that's an infinite source of meaning because you never achieve the thing. And then all you have to do, and this is a reason why I really like your metaphor of the goal and the goalpost to describe the Overton window, because one of the keys to self-deception is to find something you can believe that's plausible but wrong, but no one else knows it's wrong. So if you keep doing that mistake, you can get a lot of people with you and it feels plausible and maybe it isn't self-deception, right? And again, this is why the election mistake that you've been pointing out is so consequential, because it feels plausible that the game is the election. It feels like it is, right? I mean, it seems like it is. The TV's telling you it is. Everyone acts like it is. So if you confuse the election with the game, you're probably not going to be called out on that mistake, right? Because most people make that same mistake. Well, then it becomes it's almost like the perfect source of self-deception and self-sabotage, right? Because it's not easily identified as a source of self-sabotage. And that's always the most dangerous ones, right? Like if you're doing a self-sabotage that your neighbor can be like, hey, you're in self-sabotage, then it being a source of meaning and belonging is in jeopardy because your neighbor can come over and remove the feeling, your security in the idea that this is a valid source of belonging because they question it, right? But if everyone is making the same mistake, then it's very easy to keep repeating this source of self-sabotage and problematic tradition because no one is calling you out, right? So this mistake is a really consequential one. I think also, so there's a few things that come to mind. What you were talking about on this idea of conversations and democracy and different things, and there's a bunch of very fine nuances here that have been lost that have led to a lot of problems. So for example, you were saying that there's a way in which law teaches, right? But the way law teaches is not the same that culture teaches, right? Robert George all the time says that law teaches. But the problem is law can teach without cultivating the culturating, like culture, the subject to accept that law. So you can be taught something that by the law that you don't understand or that goes against your principles, and it leads to pathology. It leads to trouble, right? Because the law is teaching you something is wrong or right that you have not been enculturated to understand, and that can lead to some conflict. So if you simply are like, well, the law is going to teach people what's right and wrong, you're begging for trouble, right? That's like saying, well, the football rule book teaches people how to play football. Kind of, but not really. I don't know many people who play football who have literally read the rule book. And if you say, well, from the rule book will just emerge a game of football, right? It will just emerge a certain game. Well, maybe, but maybe the game that emerges is really bad. Maybe if you're just concerned on the rule, like we were talking before, like a lot of the popularist movement of, say, Sanders or going actually has manifested into Trump, right? Because you weren't worried on the culture, you were just thinking the laws and winning the election and transforming the national dialogue on the television, but not how people think. So then the game actually didn't go the direction you thought it was going to go in, right? So there's a lot of mistakes in treating the rule book as what teaches people to play the game, because they may end up playing a game, but it may not be the game you thought they were going to play. But again, maybe that's intentional because that's another source of self-sabotage that just keeps things going. The other thing you were talking about with the special interest groups that I think is really important. So there's a book called Government's In by Jonathan Rauch, and there's another book by a man named Marcis Olson called The Rise and Fall of Nations. And both of those want to chart the history of special interest groups, K Street and all these groups that are getting the politics. And a lot of people are like, oh man, like you were saying, that's so bad for government, right? You know, it destroys government. No, that actually is democracy, right? Like without these special interest groups, without these people talking to politicians, there is no democracy. Here's the issue. As special interest groups grow in power, they tend to slow down and weaken the government from being able to do anything, and you end up getting some bad policies and different things. But if the people don't engage on the ground level in democracy, well, then special interest groups have to rush in to fill the gap. And that leads to the fourth branch of government, basically, that then leads into various pathologies. Because basically, Marcis Olson, he looks at Japan, he looks at Germany, he goes through all of these different governments and say, you know, if you really look at the rise and fall of nation, it tends to correlate with the presence of special interest groups. The more special interest groups you get, the more the government becomes dysfunctional. But here's the problem. If you're not going to have a democratic society because everyone's confusing the game with the goalposts, well, then your only answer for democracy is special interest groups that in the long run don't even work, right? So if you're going to be complaining about special interest groups, well, then I love the phrase monarchy light. That's so good. Oh my gosh. So what we have now is like an identification that K Street is bad, but then without doing the game of democracy, we just fall back on monarchy light, and then we just oscillate between those two and call it democracy, and then people hate democracy and we wonder why, right? So it's very important to realize special interest groups are what democracy is going to do if you do not have a culture of democracy, which goes back to someone like Tocqueville. Because what you were saying, this relationship of the election sets the goalposts and the game is on the ground democracy, talking to people, right? That's exactly right. People have confused the voting process of democracy with the culture of democracy. And as a result, we have no idea what we're doing. And we actually end up either in special interest groups taking over or monarchy light. Great. But what ends up happening is like what Tocqueville tells you is like, no, democracy is on the ground. The key way to put this, as sociologists will talk about, and then I'll make an example of Hannah More with the abolitionist movement and give it back to you, is social imagination. Social imagination in sociology is very important. It is what the society is able to imagine, able to think, and organize their life according to. And that is all basically on the ground. That is conversation. That's what your neighbor's talking about. That's your community. That's what you're interacting. That's the realm of social imagination. And basically, for Tocqueville, to make a very big summary, democracy is the practice and cultivation of social imagination by the people with one another to create the culture they want to live in. Here's the problem. That's scary. And that's hard. And your neighbor can question your assumptions. And you have to think about what you believe. But what do you believe? Have you ever thought about there's a whole lot of anxiety that explodes onto the picture when you do that? And what Tocqueville saw is that a society of democracy that maintains practices of social imagination are really hard to maintain because people then start saying, well, I don't need to listen to you. I'm a banker. I don't need to listen to you. I'm the richest person in town. I have a position. And they start turning to their status. And you mentioned this. Status anxiety is the invisible hand. That was great too. The issue is that status anxiety will actually drive you into the hands of monarchy light or special interest groups if you're not able to handle the on-the-ground conversations and interactions of democracy. Because the first thing that happens, the natural tendency when somebody makes you question your beliefs or makes you question what you think, is to not go, you're right. Instead, you go, well, I'm the richest person in town. Well, my dad is really like that's your first knee-jerk reaction, right? And it is very difficult not to do that. But if you don't do that, then eventually you end up, well, you become democracy in name only. And you start confusing gradually winning elections with the game of the culture because you end up in disavowing the process of social imagination necessary for democracy, but you also don't want to admit you've done that. So then there's an incentive to confuse democracy with the goalposts and the voting process so that you don't have to accept that you weren't able to handle democracy. And Tocqueville is very tragic. You know, a lot of those thinkers in that period, like Tocqueville, Adam Smith, you know, they're actually quite tragic. They're not gung-ho for this. They're like, well, this is happening. Too bad. You know, there's this idea of democracy in America. Can't maintain it. It's too difficult. And so we'll see what happens, even though Tocqueville was hopeful. Like Sheldon Wolin, the great Tocqueville scholar, and he says, democracy has only ever been an event. It's been an event. There's been periods of it, and then it's fallen away. Because maintaining the social imagination process has been very rare. But this is where, again, this is where I think Hannah More's example is very good. And I think it kind of speaks to what you are saying here. Because Hannah More she was a great abolitionist. And there's a lovely book called Fierce Conventions by Dr. Pryor that talks about Hannah More. And she was working actively to get the slave trade abolished in the United Kingdom. You know, she's really working against this. And she was friends with people like Samuel Johnson. But one of the key ideas that she had, that she lived by, is that it is not dogma, it is not ethics and stuff like that, or law that changes the world. It's imagination. And so if you want to change the world, you have to, she did a lot of schoolhouse reform. She did a lot in different classrooms to change the kind of books people were reading, the kind of ideas that they were having, so that it changed the social imagination. And they could imagine that the slave was equal to them. They could imagine that the slave trade was wrong. Because that's the other thing. Like a lot of times in history, it falls into the Eichmann and Jerusalem thing, where it's like, what do you mean the slave trade is wrong? We've always done it. Like to us, that's abhorrent. To us, that's like terrible to even think people thought that way. Well, many civilizations for a very, very, very long time thought of slavery as nothing more than just the mechanics of how the world works. So what do you mean it's wrong? We're just living our lives like Eichmann. We were just doing our job, right? Like, you know, that kind of just thoughtlessness, right? Well, you cannot deal with thoughtlessness with ethics because they're like, that's stupid. They can't imagine your ethics. It feels too radical. It's outside the Overton window, right? So you have to start with an imagine a society without this. I'm not telling you we must do a society like this. I'm not moralizing you. I'm saying imagine a world like this. Imagine what is possible. And when you do that, people are able to sit without knee-jerking because like, okay, we're just imagining. All right. Okay, we're just doing a thought experiment. Okay, well, I can do that. Well, you do that long enough and you get people talking that thought experiment, if you will, and eventually they say, you know, actually, we should get rid of the slave trade, actually. Suddenly, the imagining turns into transformation. The problem, it's to your point, and this is the reason why religions or many things collapse, or ethics, or, you know, all of these. Many identities are actually just the rule book, like their beliefs, the dogma. What do you believe? I believe X, Y, and Z. Well, those are just the rules of your belief. They're not the life of your belief, right? So what ends up happening is like many religions, many philosophies, many political, like, what do you believe? Oh, you believe in the free market? Okay. Good, you have the beliefs. Those are just the parameters of being a Muslim or an atheist or conservatives or a liberal, right? But we've confused the parameters with the game, to your point, right? But here's the problem: if you tell people too quickly slavery is wrong, well, you're removing the parameters of their identity, right? You're saying I'm a bad person because my grandfather had slaves, because you haven't even emotionally moved into the place of imagining that possibility. Right? And so if you're trying to change the rules, then you end up, you're changing the entirety of a person so quickly that they knee jerk and then they react against you. And so what Hannah More is talking about is this changing of the social imagination to where people can see it. And the other thing, here's the other trick. They are able to imagine this change in their worldview or identity without deconstructing everything, without tearing up the entire world. They can see what they need to change, what they need to, sure, but it's not like this massive apocalyptic event that they're just going to reject outright, right? But that is slow and difficult work. Oh, and it feels kind of ordinary and boring. This goes to your point. It feels slow and boring and therefore doesn't give you that thrill of belonging. There's almost like a thrill of belonging that we confuse with this work of being on the slow game, the be-limiting work, and it just feels not great. But that is the work of changing and different things. And if you don't, because the last thing I'll say, and then I'll give it back to you, we always have to realize all beliefs are in a network of beliefs. Like whatever people believe, no one has an isolated belief. It's like Thomas Sowell talks about visions, the constrained and the unconstrained vision. Like if you're an atheist, that's going to inform all of your underlying premises for military spending, abortion, gay marriage, education, like it's always underlying, right? So when you are changing a person's view, you are not just changing one view. You are putting at risk the underlying structure of everything they think, right? Because one view requires the fundamental axioms that all of their views have. The obvious example is between an atheist and a theist, right? Like if you convert someone from theism to atheism, you're not changing just their religious views. That's going to permeate their entire lifestyle, right? And you see, the issue is when you don't work in the realm of social imagination, you're basically you're like destined to fail just to what it has to be a self-sabotage because you're asking people to change their entire life all at once. They're going to say no. They're not going to do that. But if you play the game, you could say, is the gradual process of slowly getting someone to change, to socially imagine an alternative, that when they change that, then on their own processing, they can start slowly moving into other areas, right? Well, that's the game. The game is to figure out, this is a way I would put it. Wittgenstein once said that repairing a tradition is like rebuilding a spider web with your bare hands. Like you're trying to restore spider web with your bare hands. Basically, the game is figuring out how to remove threads from spider webs of people's entire ideology without collapsing or putting the whole thing at risk so quickly that people react against it and reject you or go to an extremist position, to gradually be doing that surgical position of, say, putting spider webs together or taking different pieces apart. But that requires the work of social imagination. That's also, you could say, long-term and tedious. And it's not, here's the other issue. It doesn't feel as vivid. When you're fighting the bad guy, it's so vivid, it's so alive, it's so active, you can feel it. All these people, there's this emotional high. But if you're painstakingly removing threads from a spider web, that doesn't feel good. That's nerve-wracking. That's anxious, and you have to come back and do it again, and you work really hard and then screw it up. Likewise, if you're working on the social imagination of a people, you have to do it every day, come back. Some students get it in Hannah More's classroom, other ones don't. Government passes a law to make it worse, a-holes. I've got to go back and redo different things. It's so difficult, but that is democracy. The work of the social imagination, and the voting is simply setting the parameters of the game. But we've lost the concept of social imagination, and in so doing, our best hope for democracy is the special interest groups that, according to Marcise Olson and Jonathan Rauch, have an expiration date. But then the alternative to that is frickin' monarchy light, and so we're in a little trouble. Let me throw it back to you.
Yeah. Wow, I love the bringing in the imagination. I want to say one thing, because your comment about law not being able to shape culture, or I'm being a little chunky.
Sure.
But pushing back on that, when we look inter or transgenerationally, I think we do see law affect culture, but we have to look transgenerationally. Law does not affect culture within the generation it's made if the given culture has grown up antithetical to the law. So, and by the way, earlier I made what some people might think was sort of a misnomer when I said that the Republican position, and I was sort of kidding, can no longer enslave people, right? Like poor Republicans. Of course, those were back then Southern Democrats, right? So, and the Northern Republicans, of course, Abraham Lincoln was Republican, were the abolitionists. So the names can change, but the culture underlying is the referent. But back to this issue of law, and I would love to look at some of this with a little more surgical lens. Just taking the abolition of slavery, we have to assume that the cultural acceptance, and I can attest to this, and you probably can too, being in Virginia, but I can certainly attest to this, being in New Orleans, the cultural acceptance in the South of, prohibition on slavery was not overnight. It wasn't even over a century. It was a long time. It's still taking time. Now, without the law, it wouldn't probably have taken any hold, right? You needed the prohibition. And when we're thinking about how do you prevent the implicit tension between a law and a culture which runs counter to the law, I think we have to think generationally, sure, but we also have to think transgenerationally. And then, of course, we also probably should think about raising our own kids and the experiences we have with telling our kids, no, that's not good. Sharing is good. You're being selfish. We have to go to bed now. Brushing your teeth is good. I know you don't like to. All of those things that they wouldn't otherwise do and would not simply cultivate. Now, there's new schools of parenting, right, that are like, you never tell your kid no. Never say no. Only yes. And you convince them through, yes, painstaking processes of dialectical engagement, where you somehow lead them to water so that they discover through a Socratic method the very essential goodness of the thing which you wish to convince them of. I don't know if you've ever seen a parent doing this. It's a questionable tactic. I have seen some children who are absolutely out of fucking control because of this tactic.
Yes.
Like out of control in a dangerous way, hitting other children. But the parent will refuse to say you can't hit. You shouldn't hit. They refuse to lay down a law and instead try and engage strictly with an enculturation process. I can't say I'm optimistic about the strict enculturation process at scale, but I think you have a good point, which is that there, when we look in the medium term, and we look at something like abortion law, and we see these reversals and these swings, and the swings happen, you just elect a new cabinet, and all of a sudden, oh, apparently culture didn't care about that law, and now all of a sudden we're in the reverse position. Oh, I guess we're just going to keep flip-flopping, and suddenly now the game is even more convincing as an election. Because it's, again, serial monarchy, where we just invite one person to change all the laws, and then the next person gets to change all the laws, and then the next person gets to change them back, and then the next person rolls them back, and the next person re-implements them, and so on. And that's what feels futile, right? So it's about how do we get out of this situation where the game is not even being played. All we're doing is electing officials, electing temporary monarchs to implement new policy. And then depending on who's in office, those policies switch back and forth. No wonder everyone feels like this is a futile process. Yeah. And feels disempowered. So there are a few medium-term things like Obamacare. I mean, Medicaid and Medicare were not implemented under Obamacare. They were implemented in, I think, the 70s. But I mean, Social Security is a good one, right? You give someone something that they're like, okay, everyone is greedily into this. Selfishly, this is good. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I mean, this feels good to me, feel good to you. We all like this. We all like the idea of a cushion at the end of our lives. And so it doesn't get rolled back. It gets eaten into slowly, right? Or you raise taxes and it doesn't get, or lower taxes and these things. There are laws that get implemented that sort of skirt the cultural framework somehow, and or transcend the political divide. But in terms of thinking of politics in an empowering sense, I think that we do need to think of it in terms of our capacity to, in culture, using the imagination, social imagination, and using the incredible force of social anxiety and status anxiety, effectively new Overton window parameters. And that is basically what both sides are doing. I mean, that social media has really unleashed the power of status anxiety and the power of status anxiety to, in the abstract, completely affect the concrete. And it's amazing to watch, these, keyboard warriors are totally affecting real life. And it works through the function of status anxiety. If anyone's ever like, how does the abstract affect reality? Well, through status anxiety, because those are still interactions. And if that is part of the social square, the public square, and you feel like, well, the public is doing this, you start to feel like, well, I better at least pretend to be doing this. And if you look at woke, by the way, is a great example, I think. And I think it probably holds true on the MAGA side as well, but certainly on the woke side. I know through public discourse and then comparing it to private discourse with sometimes the very same people, their private views of things do not match with their public expressions. And that's the power of status anxiety, and we can see it happening, right? A great example of the Overton window moving that the left really felt, but so did the right. And the right knows this, and the right talks about the Overton window more than the left because they saw what happened when Trump came to power and suddenly started talking about, well, I don't think nationalism is that bad. I'm a nationalist. Are you a white nationalist? No, I'm a nationalist. And also, what's wrong with white people? What's wrong with white people? Whoa, big parameter shift. I didn't know you could say that in public. And all of a sudden, the alt-right is completely lit. I remember going, just out of curiosity, I went on this site that took its name from a Nazi era newspaper. I can't remember the name of it. And the kid on there, because I was doing a book on cool, you know, and I was curious because in my theory was that cool only relied on ascendant asymmetries, which basically means disequilibriums, which feel asymmetrical, meaning countercultural, and ascendant. And when that happened, I was just like, I wonder if they think they're cool now because of those riots, even though the rest of the world was like, oh my God, they're so awful and piggish and lame. Do they think they're cool now? And it was amazing because the blogger of that fairly popular sort of alt-right blog said something like, you did it. Go out and get your dick sucked, boys. You're the cool guys now. All the girls are going to want you. You're the bad boys. And at that moment, I was like, this is when I can start to see that the issues that one takes up may, in fact, be incidental to their asymmetric availability. What is the extent to which you actually essentially believe in a totally instrumental political issue? Because these issues are all fundamentally instrumental. If we've learned anything from history, it's that we move from one issue to the next, and that each issue is only ever instrumental. It's not like there's a whole bunch of abolitionists in America today. That was clearly not an essential issue, but an instrumental one. And so what is the extent to which we as activists or political creatures can admit that the issues that we're wrapped up in today are not essential, but instrumental? Can we admit that? Because if we can't, then we are really captured by the illusion of politics as opposed to using the instrumental nature of politics to our advantage. And I think it's a very disempowered place from which to approach politics, to say this issue is essential to me. It's a very disempowered place to approach politics, because what that means is you become intransigent to any solution which does not absolutely match your essential position. When you view your essential position as instrumental, suddenly you realize, oh, I can instrumentalize this position to move the Overton window, to move the game of play in the direction that I want it to move. Now, if all of the think tanks out there who are actually affecting, the special interest groups who are actually affecting policy are thinking that way, why wouldn't we? Yeah. One thing I wanted to say about change and the cultural imagination, I used to always say that the way that I change is to throw the football and then start running. That we're always imposters in the process of changing, and that this ideal may be the football, but I don't run with the football. I throw the football, because that's the fastest way to move. I throw the football and then I see if I can run fast enough to catch it. But while I'm running, I'm not the guy with the football. I'm the guy catching up to my dreams. So the idea, the very concept of imagination is the concept of a fork between your reality and a new one. So the very concept of imagining is the idea of throwing something into the future, which you are becoming, but which you are not yet. The idea of imagining something is the function of forking your current reality with a futuristic one. And the demand that as soon as I throw the football, I should have the football. I should already have the football. Well, that's a very naive way to approach imagination. It's a very naive way to approach reality. And I'm afraid that especially the left, but also the right to an extent, but especially the left, suffer from a childish, rancid naivete, which prevents them from actually winning the game. And again, this sabotage serves them in that they can constantly play the petulant child, and that the playing of the petulant child aggregates and coalesces the children in such a way that they feel that they can remain in this playpen of impossibility indefinitely. And it's all at the expense of the very things which they profess to want to change. So anyway, I know I've said that before. But yeah, I do love the imagination aspect. And I guess what I'm saying is when we use our imagination to create change, that change has not yet occurred by definition, hence imagination. And so what does that imply? Well, it implies a kind of patience. It
Yes.
implies a relationship with time.
Yes.
And a relationship with effort.
Yes.
It does not imply the whimsical new age instant manifestation.
Correct. Yeah.
And this notion of instant manifestation is a spiritual bypass, a political bypass in the concept of in the context of politics, in which we want to say, no, we want to take down the empire now. We want it to be completely aligned with our futuristic, footballed, imaginated virtues. Imagined. My exhaustion's coming back in. But we want today to reflect precisely tomorrow, now. Anything other than that, we're not satisfied with. Well, then you don't have a very good relationship to time. And makes you feel like an extra virtuous character, but it turns you into a parasitic character in which you are sucking the very lifeblood of defeat. And that becomes your sustaining body. And yeah, anyway, the relationship to time with imagination, I think, is very important.
Absolutely.
The patience, and also, you know, that relationship between patience and impatience, I think, is important. It's important to be impatient. It's important to be angry. It's important to get passionate. But can we allow ourselves the cognitive dissonance of being passionate about something that you know will take a long fucking time?
Yes. Yes.
And we seem to have lost touch with that. And I don't know that we ever had touch with that, but I would wager that we did in the era of the artisan, in the era of the apprentice, in the era of that workflow which was always implicitly and exhaustively incremental. When you could not simply become an overnight sensation, when you didn't have these endless stories about, we've really there's something that there's a role that media probably plays in this, in showing us movies in which revolutions literally take place over 2 hours or an hour and a half, and we watch this revolution compressed into a temporal object which transcends the incremental nature of progress. And so we watch these stories unfold, transcending time. And yes, they're inspiring and so on. But I just wonder why our relationship to linear time has sort of evaporated. Meanwhile, linear time continues to march on. There was one other thing I wanted to say before passing to you. What was it? It was, maybe it'll come to me. Anyway, I think that's enough for now.
Again, your Netherlands is tremendous, and I love that place. This is outstanding. So if you on what you just said, it brings to mind Paul Virilio on speeding and compression and media. There's absolutely this notion where now everything has this certain the ethical is the fast. And therefore, what we want, if we're ethical people, is to make things happen very quickly, to, et cetera, so forth. But by definition, what is truly imagination is a patience of the concept. It is a working, it is an artisan, right? We confuse imagination with the instantaneous seeing of something in our head, right? But imagination for the story writer or the musician or the architect is not that. That's just the beginning of the imaginative process and work and different things. And when we lose that, we're in big trouble, because the other thing we don't realize that we don't actually understand how much of history is affected by imagination. We think about economics, we think about material conditions, we think about laws, we think about governments, but actually what Karatani thinks about spirit, social imagination is huge. They are right there in the center of it, because, even Karl Marx at the beginning of the Capital, the commodity form, is not possible until people can imagine that bookcase is worth $20, or that bookcase is interchangeable with another phenomenon. You always have to have an imaginative change. And to your point, if I were to use Karatani's capital nation state, which I do think is a good framework, nation is where you would locate the social imagination. Whether we accept that language or not, that's the language he used. That's the identity, that's how you see yourself, that's where you imagine where you're going. And basically what ends up happening is, if you focus too much on the capital, the market, or the state, the law, the government, then you're not paying attention to the nation. Then everything that happens over here ends up alienating the social imagination, and it eventually rebels against that. And then the state squashes it and actually grows stronger because they put down a failed revolution. And so then it seems like you shouldn't let democracy happen, because look, then the capital nation state as a triplex benefits from the revolution that failed, right? Because the revolution that's successful has to be more of a long-term social imaginative process that's almost more so a reformation, whether we accept that language or not, but that's really long. And then people accuse you of not doing something now, we got to do something now. And if the ethical is the fast, you're an unethical person, even though you're working on what's effective. And what you were saying as well, it doesn't matter how impatient you are. You can't make the novel just be done. You can't just make the impatience has to be sublated into the work, right? The problem is that politics doesn't feel like building a cathedral. That's the problem. We experience it because of our media technology as something that can instantaneously change everything. So then metaphorically, because of, I think it does tie to the media technology, the very medium by which we would see politics is so quick and so fast that it creates the impression that this stuff can be done quickly. So then, we don't think of it as building a cathedral. We think about it as winning a game. And what is the soonest to appear game? The election. So then it just makes sense that we would confuse the election with the game versus the election be the goalposts for the building of the cathedral. There is really nothing in our immediate social horizon that says to us the game is a long-term game. Like, what in our daily life says that anymore? Very little. Nothing habituates or indirectly formulates us in that directionality. So then you're just kind of primed to confuse the election with the game versus the guidepost, because there's nothing in your immediacy that would make you think otherwise. And then, of course, once you do that, you can't do the work of the quote unquote nation, which is necessarily patient and long term. That is a transformation of imagination that can then, here's a way to look at it. If we take Karatani's structure, democracy is a belief that a change in imagination of the nation will spread into the state and to the market, which will then change the law and create a feedback loop, right? What Karatani points out is that it's actually in the interest of the market in the capital to make the nation not do this spreading of imagination, but to fight, to oppose the state or the market, because they're going to lose, they're going to fail, they're going to be squashed, or they're going to be captured, and then the triplex actually gets stronger. So this is the trick. The triplex, you can only change it paradigmatically, basically on the people level, by a change in social imagination that spreads into the market, into the capital from the nation. But what the triplex as a whole actually wants, the powers that be, is to get one of the parts to fight one of the other parts. So that it's a difference between change as a spreading versus trying to change by a fighting. The fighting, ultimately, the capital nation state, Karatani will argue, ultimately benefits. If you can get capitalism to fight the government, well, ultimately, everyone's in bed together anyway, with the special, so it doesn't really make a difference. If you get the nation to fight the market, then when the people start getting lower wages or they can't get a job, then the nation benefits, like, you shouldn't have opposed us anyway, and it all just feeds one another. So now this, though, before I forget, you were talking about this notion today where someone is only legitimate if they never change their mind. I always like what Lord King said. When it's like, hey, didn't you change your position on economic policy? And he said, yeah, I changed my mind when the facts change. What do you do? I always thought that was hilarious. And that speaks to the part. The other thing I was going to say before I forget is I think we are especially prone to this self-sabotage mistake when we have over-moralized the martyr. If the martyr is the basic for ethics, then actually failing makes us a more ethical person because we're martyring ourselves. So sabotage and an ethic of martyrdom go together in very dangerous ways. And yeah. I think, another thing I was thinking about, because I'm curious as an aside on the conservative version of this same mistake, maybe I always see in conservatism a notion that all change is apocalyptic change. And so there's always this idea that we're on the verge of the apocalypse. And you also have this idea where there's a kind of sabotage in religions of, say, getting to heaven, getting saved, not worrying about building the kingdom. There's a kind of sabotage in that you can never move into a position of actually improving the society, because that would remove the Armageddon sort of feeling that then removes the thrust of your political project. So it's almost, I'd have to think about it, because I think a lot about Strauss's German nihilism, which is a conservative kind of, well, if we can't live our values, then burn it all down. There's this kind of Armageddonism that is in conservatism in a different way that may be thinkable in this problem. Because it's like because the conservatives almost need the Armageddon to show up. It's a little, it is a kind of us versus them, but it's kind of rooted in a kind of Armageddonism where changing is going to destroy the world. And that means you self-sabotage yourself from ever trying to fix the world, because if you do that, there's no Armageddon by which you can then kind of make people come together. And this is also why conservatism, I think, has a nostalgic bent, because the only way to avoid the Armageddon in front of you is to go back to the past. Like going forward almost has this, it always has this kind of Armageddon feel to it. Like change is like, oh, we're going to lose what we had and it's the end of the world. I'll have to expand on that, but it's something I'm thinking about to see the conservative version of the self-sabotage that you're talking about in liberal. And it may be in that Straussian model there. That also speaks to various religious traditions of everything's going to burn up. And that's actually the identity. It's interesting that way. But I was also going to say, you're exactly right that law absolutely can influence culture and teach it. That's Robert George, that law teaches. The issue is that the way that law shapes culture is different, and it's never going to do the work of the social imagination of people changing. But if you don't have the law, you can't carry the social change through generations. But if you just have the law without the social imagination, you get civil wars. or you get rebellions, or people feel like it's tyranny, right? Like there's an interesting question. Why is it in other civilizations that got rid of slavery, they didn't, there were uprisings, but there wasn't always a civil war, like a straight up, like, we're going to kill lots of people, right? Well, because there was something about slavery, it would have to be expanded on, but if we take like a Gary Gallagher and the Civil War, there was something about slavery that was tied to the culture of the Southern identity, right? And so when you change the law and you're threatening the culture, then it's seen as tyrannical and you separate, right? But in other civilizations where you can change the law and slavery was not as tied to the culture or maintaining a certain racial hierarchy, well, then it's easier to, it's not necessarily going to be easy, but you may not get a full-fledged like war out of it because the social imagination on the ground level has already shifted in order to be accepting of that laws. Now, we can get a little cynical and say that nations that had an easier time removing slavery were strong industrial capitalist societies that just replaced slavery with wage labor, so we don't need that anymore. In fact, we can have more workers if it's not bound to race, because then white people can work for the factories. So there's a cynical take, and so I'm not necessarily, so that's the other thing, this becomes complicated. It's not necessarily, what seems like a moral advancement may be, there might be things under the surface that has to be identified. But the point is, there is a dialectical relationship between, maybe you could put it this way, there's a dialectical relationship between the culture and the law. You have to have both. That gives you the society. And the problem is, if you confuse changing law as changing culture, you're then confusing the rule book with the game. That then leads to some pathological responses or leads to some different issues. But then, of course, that self-sabotage can actually be incentivized because you're always getting an identity from it. So certainly, again, a rule book, law, can teach you how to play football. I could theoretically read the football rule book and learn the culture of playing football per se, right? But without the actual on-the-ground playing of it, I'm probably not any good at it. And probably the law never comes into effect of becoming the game. But without the rule book, the next generation may lose football, right? Because they may not know how to play it. So I think this question of the culture, the social imagination is very present now. The law is very long-term, but what happens in the present can change the long-term, and the long-term can change the present, right? So there's this bothness. The mistake is losing sight, again, going back to Karatani, the mistake is losing sight that you're always dealing with a capital nation state, all three. And you have to think about the interrelationship of all three and changing things that spread, not fight one another, because that always ultimately benefits the powers that be, because you don't win the game. You ultimately, another way to look at it, if you think the game is changing the goalposts, then whoever designs the goalpost is the winner. Whoever makes or controls the goalpost, by definition, wins. And so that's why this mistake almost necessarily leads to power, all these kind of controls of power, because you're basically saying, if the game is moving the goalpost, then whoever owns the goalpost, or who is the goalpost is never threatened. The government is never threatened. Who's ever there, they win, right? The goalpost wins in that mistake, right? And so that leads to all sorts of issues. And so we have to think of that relationship between, say, law and culture. But then the issue is, this is where I think, and then I'll give it back to you. The issue is the only way, following Karatani, or you could even look at Studebaker's book. That's fascinating, on the probability of changing democracy when you have these oligarchies, the great leveling that goes through history and shows that basically feudalism, inequality, and oligarchies are the norm, unless you have a war, bloody revolution, existentially threatening pandemic, like this book called The Great Leveling. It goes through history and shows, wow, it is really, really difficult not to lead to massive social inequality, massive social immobility, and an inability to progress, right? That's really, really difficult. Well, if we go back to Tocqueville, and it's like, well, it has something to do with, and Berger and all these other sociologists, well, it has a whole lot to do with the capacity. The game is changing social imagination, but here's the rub. Changing social imagination seems incredibly difficult without a culture of lifelong learning. Like an ability to have a continual conversation. Like we were saying, the conversation, the ability to convince people, the ability to change views. This is why they're always saying education is necessary for democracy. There's this kind of thrust of education is needed for democracy. Well, not all education is the same. Some education can be simply specialization for a job. And actually, I don't think it's by chance this mistake of essentializing positions and specialization go together, right? Because if you're a specialist in a certain area, you went to college to get your PhD in, say, environmentalists, well, then you're going to essentialize, you're more prone to essentialize the issue of, say, reducing carbon emissions. That then gives you your identity, because that's what all your education and everything has gone to, and that's what you get paid for. So you would not want to lose that job, right? In order to see that as more incidental, which seems necessary for avoiding these self-sabotage mistakes, you're going to have to be more of a generalist. But then, of course, the problem with a generalist is that they're a novice at everything, right? So you have to have generalists who, as the topic shifts, are able to get a PhD level education. Right? Like, you hit that B limit. Once the limit hits, okay, we've dealt with environmentalism. What's the next thing? Okay, the next thing is factory farming or something. Okay, we need to learn about that. Well, wait a minute. If you don't work at a college, if you don't have time to read, if you don't know people to help you, you don't have experts around you, how are you going to make the move, right? How are you going to treat issues as incidental? You're going to feel like, I'm out of democracy. I don't get to participate in democracy anymore, right? Because your issue has been addressed. So then there's this idea, I think basically this is where, and I know we've talked about it before, something like this liminal web space is basically the missing social infrastructure needed for lifelong learning to maintain a game of democracy in the sense that Tocqueville was talking about, so that people can actively engage with one another to actually play the game. Until now, basically, you're at the mercy of what the TV tells you. You're at the mercy of what the professor tells you, who then, you may trust them or not. And then it depends on the time that you have. There's a way in which the media technology for most of history has kind of been in the direction of directing you towards your group identity or the essential. Because do you watch CNN, Fox News? Who do you watch, right? It's very difficult to go outside the talking heads that are presented to you, right? That would require a different social infrastructure to make that possible, right? And there's something where I think about, and then I'll throw it back to you, where basically democracy that doesn't make the mistake of confusing the game with the goalpost and the goalpost with the game, if you will, requires a social infrastructure to maintain the ability of people to gradually and slowly train themselves to the place where they can actually engage in democracy without being overwhelmed by anxiety, like Tocqueville says, and to actually then be willing to move to a next issue, because it's like, yeah, I spent 20 years on carbon emissions. We're done with that now, but I know that there's resources there by which I can actually move to the next issue without, say, going back to college, which for most people is unrealistic. They'd have to move, like where they live, they'd have to give up their job. Like, how would you plug back into the discussion in the past without basically leaving your job behind, all your connections and everything, right? There was no infrastructure to make that possible. So I do think that this infrastructure could possibly, now I'm not trying to overspeak it or be an idealist about it, but I do think history is a story where the information technology makes a big difference on the conditions of possibility. I think we talked about it before, where, a lot of times people talk about the material condition or the idealistic condition, the ideas. Well, there's a lot of the medium condition, the very medium by which people exchange ideas or the way they're able to think has a massive impact on the kind of society that develops. And in order to have a democratic, maintained, sustainable, practical infrastructure that allows the majority of people to play in the game versus just vote in elections, and to actively be able to move from essentializing one issue to then moving to other issues so that you avoid all these self-sabotages, you would need a new medium condition, a new social infrastructure to make that possible. And this may be part of that equation. But then you would also have to then do the slow and gradual work of habituating people to this kind of activity, for them associating it with the democratic process, to them actually then also associated being educated with the ability to converse, not to memorize information and facts, the trivia game, as Neil Postman says. And all of that is the slow, gradual, patient work of social imagination, like Hannah More is talking about. That's the work that you're having to do. But if you at least realize, and then I'll give it to you, that the game of social imagination that needs to be done in concert with law, not in replacing law or law at expense of it. If it is tied to the prevalence and understanding of a medium condition, a certain infrastructure that you're also working with, that can start to do something where you're actually opening up those possibilities for democracy to play the game. Let's put it this way. We could say, I guess what I'm arguing is I'm completely sold and completely agree with what you're saying on we're confusing the goalposts with the game. We're confusing the election with the game of democracy. The question, the thing is, I wonder if the liminal web, this combination of YouTube, Zoom, these video technologies, is the infrastructure for the board, for the game, if you will. Like the politics has been the rule book, if I use that metaphor. The game is democracy, and the board that sustains the game, the field, is this liminal web technology. Now, of course, I'm not saying it's just this. You can still have live events. You can still have things in person. But this can almost be, I know Viveki has talked about Silk Roads, this is the nervous system, if you will, the blood flow to keep it going, to actually sustain those live interactions and to socially coordinate people in ways that before were not possible. But let me throw it back to you. I definitely agree, though, that law can teach. It's that transgenerational role. It's just that because it teaches and because it's so easy to change the law, that it is easy to confuse the influence laws has on people with the work of social imagination, which is a slow patience of the concept, and we have to maintain those distinctions. And the liminal web may help provide the infrastructure to do that with more and more people, the work of social imagination, to help us not fall into the mistake of overfitting law. But let me give it back to you, Mr. Ebert.
Yeah, I just, that was all great. I want to note that for anyone watching thinking, well, wait a minute, environmentalism doesn't just finish itself. You don't just complete environmentalism. There's so much to do that one during this lifetime anyway would never be finished with it. Yes. However, there are successive limits within the scope of the limited issue. So, and if you do not see that and you only take the entire pie, the utopian endpoint of environmentalism as your only limit, then you'd be unwilling to see through any successive limits in anticipation of that final limit that would get you to your goal. And you'd only be willing to say, no, it's my way or the highway. It's the final endpoint of environmentalism or nothing. Well, then, of course, what you do is you sabotage every successive step, i.e. every excessive, e.g. every successive limit that would get you to your endpoint. Now, the advantage of sabotaging every successive limit, and those limits may represent a given policy that you've been working toward, and then now you have to focus on the next policy and the successive nature of progress. The advantage of saying, no, none of those are morally sufficient or ethically sufficient. I am such a pure breed of political animal that I only accept the absolute ideal. Well, then you guarantee that your struggle will end in failure, which guarantees that you will feel like a martyr. And I wanted to come back to this this Christianity issue. You know, Girard likes to think that Christianity solves the issue of scapegoating by giving us a final scapegoat in Christ. But what he actually misses is that Christ is the ultimate model. And what does Christ represent? The scapegoat. Mm-hmm. So who is our ultimate model after whom we are modeling ourselves in the Western world? A scapegoat. Mm-hmm. So that Christianity is the proliferation and democratization of the scapegoat, actually, such that we all secretly want to be victims. Because what is a scapegoat? What was Christ? He was a victim of the Roman Empire. That's the only way you get to become a martyr, is if you're somehow victimized. Right. You believe in something so intense that you get killed for it, which is the ultimate failure, well, then that's the ultimate success. The ultimate success is failure.
Yeah. Yeah.
The ultimate success is believing in something so extreme, meaning simply outside of the Overton window, and refusing all of the sub-ultimate limits of any given issue, that your project is doomed to failure. Well, that's the ultimate success, because I get to be and feel and look like the martyr, like Christ, because that's my, even if I'm an atheist, that is the Western model. And you can see it everywhere. You can see this implicit model everywhere. It's this oppression compulsion. It's this desire to grab onto. And by the way, the one voice which always is able to detect this is actually the Black American voice, because they can always look, and I see them say this all the time, they always look at white struggle, white people who are struggling, and say, God, they're so desperate to look like they have an oppressor. They're so desperate to seem oppressed that they're willing to do X, Y, and Z. They comment about it all the time, and they're absolutely right. Now, perhaps what they miss, or what we all miss in those commentaries, is that there's a reason why we all, it's very easy when you have one of the most quintessential struggle clusters in history as a Black American to look at other people without struggle and be like, what a weird predicament. All these people who are really otherwise comfortable want to struggle so badly that they'll performatively create struggle for themselves just to feel like they have something that's meaningful. But what's missed in that analysis is that, well, historically, and especially in a Judeo-Christian framework, struggle is the portal to meaning.
Yeah.
And so without it, you do feel lost. And anyway, so that's a great a backdrop against which to think about all this. And I also just want to reiterate, it's not that you saturate the limit of a given issue and then move on to a different issue. It's that there are successive limits within any given issue. And yes, you may move from one issue to the next. But for instance, if your issue was inequality and you were an abolitionist, well, then your next issue, the next limit, after that limit is saturated and it is now illegal to hold slaves or to enslave people, your next issue might be income inequality or slave wage labor or Jim Crow or whatever the case. Okay, so I want to come back to the another thing that people watching may think, well, wait a minute, the election is part of the game, because part of the election is the magnifying of the political mind frame writ large in culture. And it's a wonderful opportunity to actually play the game and move the Overton window. Yes, because all of a sudden you have a larger voice, people are more tuned into politics, and that is a great opportunity to play the game of politics. However, what you are doing should always be thought of in the frame of moving the Overton window, moving the goalposts, not electing the figurehead. They need to be forked in order to really have an effective political approach. You need to think to yourself, I'm going to say X, Y, and Z, which may be outside of the game, in order to move the game in my direction. But that will have no bearing on who I vote for. The only bearing it will have on who I vote for is I will vote for the parameters, meaning the politician, the field of play, which most advantages my position. Not the parameters which are my position, because that's insane, because that's not possible. I will fork my passion and my ration, right? I will fork my passion and my rationality, and I will passionately advocate here and rationally vote here for the field of play which most benefits my passion. So I may say, Kamala Harris is not X, Y, and Z. She's ABC. I want X, Y, and Z. Okay, fine. That's great. You're playing the game. But you're not playing the game if then you say, and so I won't vote for the person who will most advantage X, Y, and Z. Then you're lost. Then you have lost yourself to the essentialized position, and you're no longer instrumentalizing politics. You have been instrumentalized by politics. The conservative and the conservative fears. So fundamentally, the conservative is about preserving asymmetries, in my view. Whatever those symmetries are, whatever asymmetries they inherit, whatever asymmetries they perceive, if an asymmetry, and by asymmetry, let's just say difference, a difference that is interior to the mind of the conservative. So if I have the phenotype of white skin, well, then I'm going to want to preserve a sense of unity with those with white skin. If I am rich and I see others who are rich, I'm going to want to preserve the unity of the rich, and so on and so forth. The curiosity, of course, is if I'm poor, I'm going to want to preserve the unity of the poor. That's not a very conservative approach. So they have to use other issues. They have to use the phenotype issue, the whiteness issue. They have to use the nationalism issue, and they have to use the religious issue. But all of those are, again, about preserving, for instance, the Christian coherence, the nationalist coherence, preserving whatever asymmetries they inherit, and asymmetries with respect to otherness, any otherness. And in the case of religion, it's the otherness of other religions or atheism. In the case of nationalism, it's the otherness of other nations or globalism. Right? So, and then, of course, in the case of phenotype or skin color, it's in the context of the otherness of people who look different. So that's the basic conservative position. And if any conservative out there wants to tell me, no, it's not, I would be happy to debate you about it. I can go policy by policy and show you that it is. With the exception of some very liberal policies of the conservative, like deregulation. But that's sort of another issue, a different way to think about what liberal and liberation means versus conservation. For instance, another very conservative position of the liberal is environmentalism, the desire to preserve nature, right? But anyway, I digress. The conservative then, in general, in the terms I'm thinking of it, is about preserving asymmetries, which means the conservative fears the dissipation of otherness. The conservative fears also dissipating into otherness. The conservative fears, in other words, global symmetry. And by global, I don't mean necessarily the world, but a phenomenological globalism, which may mean simply dissipating into the Mexican, or dissipating into the atheist, or somehow dissipating into the the Baptist, into the Protestant. It doesn't matter which asymmetry we're talking about. So if the conservative fears dissipation of asymmetries, they're going to sabotage union with other asymmetries, sabotage union with otherness. Now, you see this when they hyperbolically broadcast the threat of otherness. Fox News, not to bring up an old, like tired idea, but Fox News obviously hyperbolically broadcasts the threat of otherness. Now let's just take the word hyperbolically out. They broadcast the threat of otherness. I think everyone's going to agree with that, right? Well, yeah. And the conservatives are going to be like, because others are a threat. Now, what you have to understand, and if you're going to be an honest conservative, you have to know that the position of believing that others are a threat is fundamental to the instrumentalization of the conservative position in the first place. You have to have a threat of otherness. Now, if you have to have a threat of otherness, might that not mean that you may need to, at certain times, invent a threat of otherness to continue the conservative position? Well, yes. Now, I just want to also say, and this is something I just talked in my recent talk with Daniel Pinchbeck, when I'm talking, I prefer thinking about conservative and liberal in sort of thermodynamic terms, in which I'm basically describing now, where we have one position which is about the conservation of asymmetries and another position which is about the dispersing of asymmetries. Right? One position which desires to aggregate in a general symmetry, and the other position which desires to create asymmetries and preserve them. Now, all of a sudden, we'd be like, wait a minute, then isn't woke conservative in the desire to retribalize essential categories of human existence? And just simply the desire to retribalize in general and create intransigent unities that are asymmetries themselves, which are very highly gate-kept, in which now I can no longer dress up as a woman because I would be appropriating an essential category? Well, that's a very conservative position because it is about the preserving of asymmetries, right? It's not about equality. It's about disequilibrium. And that's not bad. And I want to make clear to everyone, like, the conservative isn't wrong, because in order to experience life itself, we need disequilibrium. I mean, on a physical level, this is some of the premise of thermodynamics, the premise of cosmogony of the universe. The universe requires difference. In order for a planet to exist, it must conglomerate vis-a-vis gravity. Gravity is a force of asymmetry. It makes this thing a thing so that this thing can be a thing and then work against each other, holding my body together in asymmetric form so that I do not dissipate into the nothingness of everything, so that I can experience something. So the force or the impulse toward asymmetry, which represents the conservative position, is a requirement for life itself. But in order to progress, in order to experience the difference of difference, those asymmetries, historically, cosmologically, have to explode and dissipate. It's the second law of thermodynamics. Entropy occurs in any closed system. Everything is going to tend toward entropy. And so what do you have? You have entropy, which is the force which wants to dissipate asymmetries. And then you have negative entropy, which is the force that wants to conglomerate and preserve asymmetries. And then you look at society and see, whoa, well, there's the liberal and conservative in a nutshell. They need each other. And to form new universes of thought or new universes of material, you need both forces. And so then we get into the metapolitical, where we're not thinking about the Overton window just as what do I do for my side? But you think about, okay, I see that the game is a holistic operation. And I bring this up just because I think it may be a portal. Some of us that may be listening to this may think to ourselves, or may be so, how do I put this non-pejoratively, so impassioned about our political ideas and ideals that we do not want to engage with the other in any positive way, because we feel that it may impinge on the very passion required to hold our position effectively in the first place. So we want to view the other, or view our opponent, as a bad guy, because it helps to increase the passion that we bring to our position, which increases the effectiveness of our actions at that position. So it's very difficult, obviously, to maintain passion and the need for change now, while knowing that that change now chant is an instrument that will bring change slowly and can only bring change slowly. Yes, you can bring it a little faster or a little slower, depending on how passionate you are, but to know that the change that you're seeking now is going to happen eventually is a very difficult place to be. You have to be a grown-up to be able to deal with that.
Yeah.
But one thing that I think may help people become grown-ups is when we take the conversation out of politics and we just look at the formation of the universe. And we just see the operation of asymmetries bursting into symmetries, conglomerating into asymmetries again, and we see the basic operation and force and function of entropy and negative entropy as requirement or prerequisite for experience itself. Now, if it's a prerequisite for experience itself, might it be a prerequisite for politics? And then from that position, I think it's easier to be like, I see. I can now think of politics as an instrument to play, as opposed to me being the instrument that's being played, as opposed to being played by the special interest groups. Because if you think that it's essential and that's all you think it is, you cannot actually have any agency. All you are doing is being limbically hijacked and or choosing to limbically hijack yourself in favor of a position while never being able to instrumentalize that position, which then means you're always shooting yourself in the foot and refusing any sub-ultimate limits. And again, by sub-ultimate limits of any issue, I mean the incremental steps of any procedure which may get you to the end you desire. So anyway, I think that's it. Yeah, that's what I had.
Magnificent. So a few things. I love everything you said. I agree with all those clarifications. The clarifications were outstanding. If we were to think VPA that Mr. Bard puts forth, basically the metapolitical is on the P, and the P is this very small little dot between the virtual and the actual, and this limit, this little line right here. And between the conservative and the liberal, the dynamic and the static, these are a dialectic that have to be worked to maintain the P. And if we lose the P, we're gone. And the conservative tends to want to go back to the actual, the past, without the liberal goes to the virtual without the actual. And both are trying to either get to the V or the A, and neither are doing the work of the P, if we use that framework, right? And so the metapolitical would be maintaining the P. But the P, of course, is this really small dot between these vast oceans. I suppose Bard would say enormities, but of the enormity of the V and the A. And that's kind of, this little small dot is kind of unsexy. It's kind of humble. It's like, it's so small, and yet it's everything, right? And it's a kind of limit, of course, right? And so there's also something about the metapolitical, to your work, is this real focus on the work of the limit. Because in a way, limits are meta. They almost have to be kind of meta, because the bookcase nothing experiences its own limit, right? Like, limit is always a between, an encounter, a surprise. And even when that bookcase gets part of the wall, it's melted into the room. So it's the limit between the wall and the bookshelf is practically not even a limit anymore, right? So there's always something kind of meta about limits, in the sense of when you're thinking about limit, you're not encountering limit. So it's a reference to something that's not there that you have to think, so that when it is there, you attune yourself and respond to it in a different way, right? And so the metapolitical is on this kind of like thinking the limit, the point between the P, between V and A, but also between conservative and liberal. And I think when you're talking about the universe, metaphorically, to help with all this, that's really important. Because if you don't have that static, that conservative sort of stability, then you're in trouble. But then, of course, if you don't have the dynamic, you're in trouble, right? Well, then the limit between those two, the point where the gradient in the sky, like a sunset, It's all like, it's like from turns to red to blue. There are kind of limits there, and yet there are not limits at the same time, right? That's what's really weird. There's this limit to where it's totally red in a sky gradient with like colors, like it becomes a different color, but there's a certain bleeding that occurs, right? A sort of blending that occurs. In the metapolitical, you have to maintain that blending, or else you get all these problems, just like you see in the universe, right? But thinking that is quite difficult. And I was also going to note, I completely agree with what you were saying on the conservative and otherness. My experience is that there's this treatment of the other in conservatism as a threat, and also an apocalyptic threat, because if you even try to empathize with the other, then you're risking the apocalypse. You're going to destroy the country. Like, there's the apocalyptic level is kind of what in the liberal, there's this, you're satisfying for Kamala Harris, there's a betrayal. There's a certain giving up, and it's kind of like, how dare you? There's a kind of how dare you-ness to it when you confuse the goal with the goalpost, and that how dare you contributes to the and then I'll give it to you, contribute to the self-sabotage. It's almost like a conservative, it's like, how dare you risk the apocalypse? How dare you risk everything, that kind of, but Mr. Ebert, please.
When you say risk the apocalypse, the way that I want to interpret that is risk destroying the apocalypse. I'm not sure if that's what you meant, but the conservative seems to need the apocalypse.
Yes, yes.
As a dangling.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. There's an irony there, because it's like you actually can't have the apocalypse occur, so you keep it kind of dangling. That kind of keeps it away. And it has this kind of function, this self-sustaining function. I interrupted you, Mr. Ebert.
No, this is just a conversation, because it's not something I've thought through. But the fear of the dissolution of otherness, the fear of the dissolution of xenophobia, the fear of the dissolution, in other words, of asymmetries, is ultimately the fear of the dissolution of apocalypse. Because of apocalyptic sort of narrative requires an otherness so severe that apocalypse occurs.
Yeah.
Now, I think for the conservative, the actual apocalypse then is the uniformity of the progressive endgame. The actual apocalypse is the utopic symmetry of the dissipation of otherness. And that's not crazy. I don't mean to paint the conservative as crazy, because that's also the fear of scientists with regard to universal heat death,
right,
which is the ultimate dissipation of asymmetries, because that is the ultimate endgame of entropy, if you believe that.
Yeah.
So the conservative position, the real apocalypse, is where we are all getting along, where we're all effectively the same, where everywhere you go, everyone looks like you, or at least you're not afraid of anyone. There is no phenomenological otherness.
Yeah, that's right.
And that would be the destruction of asymmetries, and that is the destruction of conservatism, and that is the conservative apocalypse. And so the conservative really needs the apocryphal narrative of apocalypse, because in some ways that is emblematic of the very notion of conservatism, or the imaginative conglomeration of conservatives seems to be underpinned by, is underpinned by the need for asymmetry, which itself is underpinned by a fear of otherness, which itself reaches its apotheosis in the notion of apocalypse. Such that if we were all to really get along, and suddenly we had no fear of other, that would represent the dissipation and dissolution of conservatism, which itself would represent the dissipation and dissolution, potentially, of phenomenology itself, of the phenomenal experience of you and me being different people. So it's not a crazy fear, but it's packaged crazily.
Sure.
Because I don't think most conservatives understand that their actual fear is getting along with everyone.
Right. No, I think that's brilliant. I think I like the idea of the apocalypse of the apocalypse. I'm so big on irony. And basically the issue is that without the metapolitical, without that kind of thinking, politics will always be ironic. In the sense of the very thing that is making your identity you're actually against to get your identity that leads to all these kind of pathologies, right? It's just like with the goalpost go thing. So there's all these ironies that occur. And basically to think the P is needed in the VPA for the dealing of this problem of irony, or else you just end up in some irony of some kind, right? And so like also with the apocalypse, what's very interesting on the apocalypse of the apocalypse, I think that's exactly right, because you need the apocalypse in order to keep the apocalypse, where if you actually get it, you would get rid of it and you'd get along, right? And you would lose the basis of your identity. But this is also where they're always, in a way, the metapolitical would train you to necessarily have a certain sublative willingness, where you're willing to be sublated. When you get to it, wait, there actually is a possibility to get along with more people. I'm willing then to have a sublative possibility occur, where I have the apocalypse of the apocalypse and I give up the conservative on the next threshold, right? And the same if there's a way in which what happens without the metapolitical, there's no sublative willingness on either side of things. And so that's where we get screwed. And I like also the apocalypse of the apocalypse, because it's kind of funny where the other word for apocalypse is revelation. So you're basically keeping there from ever being a revelation of what you're doing as a conservative, right? You want to keep that from ever happening, where if you actually really did truly believe the other was apocalypse, then this sounds terrible, but you would like kill them, right? Like you literally launch a military invasion to get rid of all otherness. And then when you did this, you would go, wait a minute, this really is the apocalypse. Oh, like that's always the problem. It's almost the problem is that you don't think it to the extreme. Like you've made that point before, right? Well, if you actually then treated others like the threat that they are, and you took that to its logical end, well, yeah, you would end up in a pretty terrible place, right? That would seem like something out of an apocalyptic movie, right? So the problem are these kind of moves where you don't take it to the extreme. Therefore, you never get the apocalypse of the apocalypse. You never get the total saturation, right? You never get the fulfillment of the political project. And that lack of fulfillment, I think, is going to always occur where there's not a willingness for sublation, a sublative willingness, which is what thinking the metapolitical necessarily, slowly and gradually can train you to be willing for, because you see how you need both, right? You need how they both have a role. Here's the problem. The issue is that it is not self-evident outside the experience and encounter which you need when. Like, that's the problem. That's why it always has to be active, because sometimes you may need more emphasis on the conservative, and other times more emphasis on the liberal, more emphasis on the static, other times the dynamic. You can't know ahead of time. There's no way. It would have to be encounter by encounter by encounter, right? So you have to stay with the P. You can't slip into the V, you can't slip into the A. You have to stay with the P. Well, how do you stay with the P? You'd have to have regular training in the metapolitical, a regular infrastructure like a liminal web to habituate you to the training in it. Otherwise, you're going to slip out. And so the timing of the relationship per se, Javier Rivera will talk about a philosophy of timing. The timing is completely contingent upon a space of encounter, a space of limitation, of running into things. Without that, it seems basically inevitable, because you hear people all the time, like very few liberals are going to straight up say, there's no role at all for anything conservative ever, right? Just like conservatives are very rarely going to say there's no role for anything liberal ever. It just happens to be the case that it's never time yet for the liberal, or never time yet for the conservative, right? It just happens to be the case that it could, it just never does, right? Well, that's because you've removed the possibility of encounter, because you don't have the infrastructure or the political the metapolitical to actually have the encounter occur when you can figure out the timing, right? And then you'd also have to be trained as subject to handle that encounter, which is very difficult. But this, I just wanted to also note, then I'll give it, this is where I do put at the root of a lot of this. You brought up the martyr Like we need the martyr of the martyr per se. In the same way you need the apocalypse of the apocalypse, we need the death of the martyr structure. Because that's behind all of it. There, I don't know if I want to say art of this, all of this, but there hasn't been a martyrdom of the martyrdom, right? And that's been a big freaking problem. Because like, so for example, without getting too much into it, the reason Christians are wearing a cross in the Roman Empire is because it's a middle finger to the Roman Empire. It's not that we want to be crucified. It's that the worst thing you can possibly do to us is crucify us, and we don't care. Martyrdom isn't the freaking goal. They're not looking to be crucified. It's courage. They're saying, Rome, do your worst. F you. But the freaking it's more courage. It's more a thing of courage, right? But we've taken a very problematic theology and we've made it about being martyred versus courage. Again, there's all this emphasis on being a martyr versus being a saint. There should be way more emphasis. Like, it's not about being a martyr, it's about being a saint. It's just that a saint has to be willing to die for something. Death is not the goal. It's more like beauty, it's more like Simone Weil, it's more like sainthood. But you've had this horrible, horrible take where martyrdom is the ethical principle, as opposed to sainthood and courage, if you will, of which are willing to die for something, but the goal is not death. The goal is figuring it. Yeah, you could say like a Martin Luther King's a sainthood kind of person, right? But his goal is not to be shot, but it's an understanding that that may occur, right? But this is the problem. This, I think, goes back to the speed. So then there's this question: why have we come to make martyrdom the basis of ethics versus courage or sainthood or beauty or other things like that? Because I think it does tie, though, to the speed thing. Because martyrdom is, like, it's more self-evident what it means to be martyred. You fail or you die, right? But what does it mean to be courageous? I don't know. Like, also, if you don't have a limit society, what is courage other than being closed-minded or reifying your pre-existing beliefs, right? It's very hard for us to think what is courage if you don't make space for otherness or make space for the encounter with the limit, right? So we're like, I don't know. So we can't do that. Like, what does it mean to say strive to do something that's beautiful, something that's meaningful, or something that's going to make a difference? I don't know. And a lot of people disagree with you, but we can all agree that if you get killed, there's a chance you're a martyr, right? There's a way in which it's more kind of evident in its logic, right? So I think that's part of the problem. Also, yeah, a lot of times in history, the people that are really working to make a difference, thinking the metapolitical, that are doing the slow, gradual work of an Abraham Lincoln, they get killed. A lot of times they do get shot. So it's then easy to take that to go, oh, martyrdom and ethics tend to go together. Yes, but it's not. It goes to what you're saying. It's not an essential relationship. It's more of an incidental relationship, right? And if you don't get that, then you start actually aiming for martyrdom as the goal, and this leads to all sorts of problems. And again, it just kind of goes. We don't understand. We need to get an understanding that transformations or politics is kind of unsexy, slow, and arduous. Another thing, so that's one mistake contributing to this inability to enter the metapolitical. We have this ethic of the martyr that is, martyrdom should be incidental, not essential. There's all sorts of mistakes that have come with that. And I'm not trying to say that martyrs have not done incredible things. No one is saying that. But martyrdom is a secondary thing. It is not a goal, right? Like, if you make it a goal, then you get all of these pathologies that develop, right? Now, you can gamify martyrdom and know that if you get killed, then that can lead to a public outcry and all these things. You can do that, but notice that you wouldn't get killed if it couldn't lead to a public outcry that would turn people toward things, right? So it's not just the martyrdom for martyrdom's sake. It's always tied to a network of consequences, right? So that has to be kept in mind. So that mistake has been really consequential. The other mistake is we have very erroneous interpretations of the histories of various laws being passed. And I'll just make one example, the Emancipation Proclamation, because we've talked about Abraham Lincoln. There's this idea that there was slavery, and then a law was passed, and slavery went away, right? The Emancipation Proclamation arguably freed almost no slaves, if it freed any, because it applied to southern states that didn't, like, it was for southern states that didn't even listen to it, right? Like, the Emancipation Proclamation only was going to have an effect to the degree that the North won the war. And it was also to create turmoil in the South where a lot of slaves would try to free. and also it arguably had a role of keeping Europe out of the war, right? Because Europe didn't want to get involved with the Confederacy now because they would be seen as supporting slavery, right? But the Emancipation Proclamation wasn't a done kind of thing, right? It was part of a larger network of activities, military, legal, all sorts of different things that you can even argue didn't fully succeed because then you just had the Jim Crow South come into play, right? So when you go through history and you look at, you get this impression that a law can change and then bam, everything's fixed. Yes, law makes a big deal, but it is a much more arduous, difficult process that has to be worked through. And then arguably it can be very, very difficult. But if you don't think that, because you get this impression that bam, things were changed. Like that's the other issue. Like once the slave trade in Europe, was abolished, it makes it seem like it just happened out of nowhere, right? It's just like suddenly and all at once. Well, there was this real slow, arduous work of people in the Congress and Hanamore and the Winchester doing the work to get people on board with that because they were experts at playing the game. But you don't see that. You don't see that. And so you get this impression of a certain instantaneous mindset that then makes you focused on winning elections so that you can write the laws and then everything's going to be good. Well, maybe you do that. And then 4 years later, they get overturned, which then ultimately, this is my last point, it then ultimately leads to a massive emphasis on the Supreme Court because they're the ones who can just change an interpretation and then, the law changes and then everyone has to change all across the country, right? Well, then you end up in a kind of oligarchy. There's another term for this, where the country is run by the Supreme Court. And now the game is, the light monarchy, the monarchy light is the Supreme Court. All of this leads to various pathologies, and it is not doing the work of the metapolitical. And if we do not do that work, then we're not going to develop courage. We're going to continue to have an ethic in the direction of a very toxic martyrdom that is very problematic. And we're also going to continue to believe that things don't require this long wrestling and process to get to the place where you're going to go. So politics will continue. Well, then this would be my final point, and then I'll give it back to you. In this environment, what can politics do but become extreme and like a mess, right? A politics that doesn't think the metapolitical ends up like politics is today, not because it's broken, but because it's heading toward the logical end of where it's going to go if you don't have the medical political, right? Like this is where democracy goes without the metapolitical. This isn't a mistake. This doesn't mean something is broken. This is the tract of the logic you're going to go without the metapolitical, right? And so if you can continue to play in that framework all freaking day long, and it will just get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. If you're not able to think the metapolitical, then you're just going to head toward a great leveling. Studebaker, what he's talked about, continued collapse of the Olson and different things. But let me give it back to you, Mr. Ebert.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I had a dream is a good example of using the imagination. The dream, of course, in that speech, Martin Luther King is not. Wouldn't it have been funny? He said, "I had a dream last night that needs to be implemented today. Let me tell you about it." That wouldn't have done fucking shit, right? Everyone been like, "You're insane," and nice dream. But no, like, what are you talking about? The dream had no temporal limitation to it. He knew that. I mean, that's the entire point of I had a dream in which a future would be like this. And he inspired a collective social imagination that transcended the petulant desire to have the change occur now. Every revolution is an evolution in disguise. Every revolution is an evolution in disguise. And the problem is that I think it's not even media that compresses the narrative of incremental change and evolution. It's simply historical distance. It's the problem of narrative.
Yes.
Narration compresses effort. Narration itself. So when you say, "Oh, tell me about Grandpa. How did he do? He was in the war. How did they win it?" Well, he went there and they did the thing and they shot their guns and then they won. Wow, I guess success happens quick. You told me that story in 5 seconds. Right? All of a sudden, our relation
That's true. Yeah.
to actuality becomes so compressed by historical difference and narrative that our phenomenological experience of history is experiencing so much information loss that the packaged nugget of our understanding of any given success point, any given limit, that is, of any historical process, is molested to the point of indecency. It gives us a completely warped sense of the effort that it takes to complete any given process. And and then the other problem is that the further we get from any historical event, of course, the more chunked it becomes in our own memories of our own lives. We think, oh, I remember when I met my wife. It happened like that, and it all compresses, and we experience so much informational loss. All of the nuance of the day-to-day, the moments get lost. And so in some ways, I think we need to tell different stories. We need to tell slower stories. We need to tell more granular stories. And if we need to tell those stories 5 hours at a time, so be it. But maybe there's a way to tell stories, even at the increments we're used to, at the 5-minute, 30-minute, 1 hour, and an hour and a half scale, that are themselves reflective of a granularity that itself is compelling in and of its granularity. Because that is ultimately where the struggle is in the granular effort, the mundane, day-to-day, the trudging. That's where the struggle is. And when we succumb to packaging these stories in the way that our brains want us to package them, in the way that our brains, by virtue of the evolutionary pressures of minimizing free energy and minimizing the energy with which we perceive the world, the incredible sloppiness of neatness, right? I mean, packaging things neatly is an incredibly informationally sloppy approach.
That's good.
If we can work against that current and tell stories that unpack these neat little collapsed clumps of history in ways that really detail the granular moment-to-moment struggles, whether that means telling a slice of history that is just a slice, not the pie, but a slice, taking place over a couple days even. I mean, these are the stories I think we need to tell, because we have such a fixation on the event that we do forego process, to use some of Bard's language there.
Yep.
We have such, especially in Christianity, with such a focus on event, whether it's revolution, whatever it is, that we completely forego the granular details of those events, which essentially foreclose the possibility that we can engage in those events ourselves, because we negate the very narrative notion of process which begat those events in the first place. And so we don't teach ourselves how to proceed. We only teach ourselves how to event.
Yeah.
And if you've ever experienced, as a kid, I used to experience this all the time. I was just telling my girlfriend about my 13th birthday party. I was always really culturally aware for some reason as a kid. And growing up as a white kid in the Valley, the only culture that I saw that I was like, oh God, I really want to be a part of that, it was the Mexicans and the blacks, right? The Mexicans and the blacks, and here I am, this white kid, and I'm like, why don't I feel like I have any culture? Why are they having such a good time? I want to be a part of that. Look at how they hang out. Look at how they fiesta over there. Look at that barbecue. God damn, why have I not experienced anything like that? Why do they seem to know each other so intimately?
Yeah.
What's up with those handshakes? What's up with that sort of just hanging out silently on the lawn? What is that? I want that. So on my 13th birthday, I was like, I'm going to have that. I'm going to have a birthday party that feels like that. And I'm going to set it up like that. And I convinced my mother to do that for me and like get this little event space. And I invited and I put my little DJ set up and I got lights and I got a fog machine. And I was going to have my own little bar mitzvah. The other people I saw have that too were the Jewish kids that I went to school with. They would have these bar mitzvahs. I'd be like, what is that? Why don't I have that? So I set up my own little coming of age, quinceañera, fucking bar mitzvah for me. And I thought, well, this will work. So I had it, and I will never forget the immense disappointment of realizing that you cannot create an event without a process.
Yeah.
It was the most vapid party you could possibly imagine. There was no lineage, no history, no process which led to it. It was fully canned. And that's when I realized, oh my God, I don't have any culture. And it was like an incredible revelation. And I think that's the way a lot of people in this country feel. And so we look for any way to begin cultivating culture, and the easiest way is struggle. And so when we suddenly see woke, it's very easy for a white person to suddenly be like, finally. Now, either being, it doesn't matter which way, either being woke, that'll do it, or being anti-woke, even better. Now I'm the oppressed. That's what I wanted. I needed to feel like I was part of a struggle, either way, whichever way you go. And so either are incredibly attractive. And that's why, African Americans or, Black America, like laughs at white woke people. Because they're like, look at these people. Look how seriously they're taking our issues. In fact, they're taking them so far, we don't even recognize the movement anymore. Exactly what was their struggle again? So anyway, so that's the state of things at the moment. And I probably am out of brain power at this point. I need to go take a nap again because I woke up. I've been burning candles. But anyway, it's been an amazing conversation.
Mr. But I was about to say, unless I have to fricking go to work in 15 minutes, so I will have to go. But I love your Netherlands. And if these candles you've been burning have been complete fireworks, and there's a few things that come to mind in closing. I want to throw at you really quickly. I'll just let you reply to this. I really like, the process and event. I think is exactly right. You have a Christianity with event but no process. I do wonder if one of the reasons the Black church has done better is because even if they fall into a Roman road theology in Christianity, they still have a social justice because they have to. And so they end up having process in there with the event, even if it's not theologically integrated. And so I wonder about that. And then also I agree with Christianity being event with no process, like Jesus dying on the cross was what counted, not his entire life. And you have people like Scott McKnight and N.T. Wright being like, this has been a disaster, and you've gotten this event without process. And I completely agree. What I'm wondering is, can we say, this is what's interesting as you were speaking, so I'll throw it to you quickly. It's almost like conservatism, weirdly, it's a process because it's all about history and tradition, but it's been focused on an event and being merged with a kind of Christianity that's Roman road based. So it's process, but focused on an event, so it becomes odd. Liberalism becomes event when it's because of winning the election or the revolution, when it's almost like liberalism is more, but it doesn't have the process. There's some interesting, maybe metaphoric structure here. So let me throw it to you.
Yeah, I would say liberalism is actually all, how do you say this? It's so interesting. Liberalism functionally is all process. Ideologically, all event.
That's right. Yes. Yep.
Intentionally, so that they never get to event.
Yes.
But they're all about the event.
Yes.
And the event gives them the moral superiority and so on, but never reaching the event ensures they maintain the moral superiority.
Yep. No, I think that's exactly right. And the conservatives is kind of the mirror of that in American conservatism. And it creates this very weird, well, I guess the other thing I would say, without the metapolitical, you're going to end up in one of those ditches. You're either going to be fundamentally processed, but thinking of yourself as event. So that leads issue, maybe focus. Maybe you're fundamentally an emphasis on event, but you're focused on process, or maybe you're neither. What you need is both, right? But the issue is, this is what's weird about both. There's a lot of people now that say you need freedom and equality. You need justice, and security. You need, but everyone, like more and more, the rhetoric of people is we need both. That rhetoric is completely useless unless you know the distribution of the bothness relative to a given situation. That fundamentally means you require encounter and metapolitical. If the answer is both, then the answer is only determinable in encounter, in limit. And maintaining the space of encounter is the work of the metapolitical, because it's in the P of the BPA. And so you have to stay in that little small spot of the encounter, of the limit, because otherwise you can't figure out the distribution of bothness. Like everyone says, oh no, there's truth to, everything has truth. What's the distribution? In what particular way? That's too general. Yes, saying it's both is better than saying it's one versus the other, but even that is still too general, because you have to go to the particular, but the particular is the encounter. It is the limit. It is the P. Otherwise, you're in trouble. The other thing I was going to say quickly on what you're saying about better stories, I think that's completely correct. When Plato is talking about writing destroying memory, which, there's something, what he's talking about is oral traditions were, like when you read Homer, every detail was there, like to the point where it's like too much. Like, you don't have to tell me everything, buddy. You can read the book Auerbach with Memensis, where he compares Exodus with Homer. It's like in Homer, everything is there. In Exodus, in Judaism, you start moving toward a scroll tradition. It's much more limited. Abraham went to the mountain. Like in Homer, it's going to be Abraham was wearing this, and there was this, and it's over and over and over. And in the oral tradition, there's much less compression. And I think when you look at Plato, there's more, what he's talking about with the loss of memory is tied to this compression problem. It is not merely being forgetful, but it's the fact that you don't remember. Well, the problem with forgetting is you don't remember, you forget. You likewise, let me put it this way. The more you move toward a written tradition, you actually kind of get a better mental imagination. You can see more inside. You can look at William Ong and these different people, like writing in an inside, more or less. Like you get that, right? When you have a verbal tradition, you tend to, if you're angry, you tend to act angry. You're not able to hold in your anger, right? So what ends up happening is in a writing tradition, you're more imaginative, which means you can fill in the space of the lack of details, because you can imagine what it looks like if Abraham goes to the mountain. Here's the problem. We always overestimate how good we are at imagining, right? We actually aren't that good of imagining what it means that your grandfather went off to World War II and fought. We think we do because we can play a movie in our head, but that movie is probably aggrandized. It lacks feeling, it lacks hardship, it lacks all the negative emotions. That's the other problem. When you tend to imagine something, even if what you're imagining is like of a war, you don't experience it like a war. You actually imagine more like a movie. When you're watching Saving Private Ryan, you may go, but you're not really feeling the same as the actual battlefield, right? So that's why an imagination, it becomes more difficult to actually feel in a real granular way the experience of war when you can better imagine war, and yet it makes it seem like you can feel it, and that's another kind of self-deception thing going on there. There's a historian, because I really appreciate this point on better stories, because I think it's critical. There's a thinker named Hayden White, who was a philosopher of history, and he was really critical of the way history was written, because he wanted to say, he was fighting the temptation to think of history as a science. He wanted people to say, no, it's literature, it's art. And that sounds like a downgrading of history. But actually what he was saying is, if we do not write history like art, people are less likely to get the granular reality of it, and we're less likely to learn from history. It's the exact opposite of what people think. Historians were like, if we make history as science, then people will learn history. Hayden White's like, no. Same thing with Shelby Foote. Shelby Foote had this line out of Cates where he's like, a fact is not a truth until you love it. And the only way to make history's truth to people is to put them in a situation of falling in love with them, precisely so they can encounter the great devastation of that love being broken in the narrative. So history that isn't literature, ironically, it is history that is literature that is more likely to actually avoid the mistakes of compression that you're describing. And yet we turned it into a science in the name of making people not make that mistake, and it's an irony. You get the exact opposite of it. It's exactly what has occurred. We're just not very good at telling stories, ultimately, and that's getting us into trouble. And ultimately, and the last thing I'll say, and then I'll give it back to you to close, and I've really enjoyed this, is that if we actually did become better storytellers in this way, and we set the bar higher for being more granular, and we actually set the social imagination as fighting compression, as expansive, you might be able to start working status anxiety in the direction of getting people to do that. Because if everyone else is doing that, people are telling better stories. I don't want to tell a crappy story. I don't want to be one of those people who are compressing. And you start changing the social imagination, because this was the point. Social imagination can change the orientation of status anxiety. And if you can transform what people socially imagine, then what they feel status anxiety about can change, and that invisible hand can start directing people. But this has been an amazing, it's been an amazing conversation. I've really enjoyed it, Alex.
In closing, I'll say that I just got a flash of, let's say, the next Marvel movie being a character study of Iron Man between movies 12 and 13, dealing with a day in his life, was very difficult, in which he got in an argument with his wife, and his child came home from school after being bullied, and he spent the day working on his suit, and ultimately felt adrift. And then came back home after having some very interesting conversations with his wife, and doing some thoughtful consideration with some of his friends, and maybe seeing, maybe going hunting and experiencing a strange sense of doom at killing a sacred deer and bringing the meat home, and that's the end of the movie, and then the movie ends. But it's a Marvel movie, you know, it's Robert Downey Jr. It cost $200 million, and that's what the people get. I just think, you know, these are the sorts of story, like, just as a thought experiment, I like the idea of creating a sort of character study version of one of those characters, because that is sort of the cold water we need in our face in terms of the narrative predicament we're in. We need to realize that there was a lot more going on than just those couple scenes, and saving the world was actually not, you know, didn't happen so quickly, and so on. And you know, but anywho, one of the great things about the Marvel arc actually is that it really did take about 18 movies to get to the game. So I'm probably unfairly using Marvel when actually, if you look at that arc in aggregate, it's actually pretty incredible, the arduous sense of work there. So I just disputed my own idea, but with that, I will claim that I am brain dead and bid you adieu.
I will bid, but you know, I think it's actually perfect, because the first run of Marvel that built up process and event was extremely successful, and the second phase after the second Avengers movie that doesn't have a clear arc that it's going in and can't build up has sucked. So it's all just kind of a testament to the metapolitical need of needing both. If you can pull it off, it's incredible, but if you can't pull it off, it's problematic. And
you have to be headed somewhere. And I think everything since Endgame is like, okay, we're just going to have our big events. Each film is going to be an event, and it begins and solves the problem in the same in the span of the hour and a half. And that is insufficient.
Correct.
In terms of storytelling. Yeah.
And I think the title of the talk can be what you said, saving the world didn't happen so quick. I laughed. But Mr. Alex Ebert, it's always a treat to speak with you, sir.
Likewise,
Thank you
Dan.
so much. All the
Talk
best.
soon. All
All
right.
the best. Thank you, sir.